So when I worked for the Joint Multinational Readiness Center as a planner, we would help other countries plan exercises, specifically in the NATO realm, interoperability, things of that nature, where we would work together with other countries. And often we would travel to other countries to sit down with members of their ministries of defense or whatever to go over the plans and how the U.S. can integrate and bolster the alliance. It was a great opportunity for me to go to places that a lot of Americans just don't really go, like Latvia or Romania or Poland, etc. Countries that I absolutely hope that Americans would go to. I mean, I went to Wroclaw. It's amazing. I can tell you the food in Riga, Latvia is some of the best in the world, period. I went to 4 restaurants there for dinner, 4 different restaurants, and every single one was amazing. So if you ever get a chance, go eat food in Riga, Latvia. Best steak I ever had in the world was in Riga. And no joke, I've eaten steak in like Texas, Oklahoma, all over. Anyways, it's beside the point. So when I went to Latvia, I was able to speak with a senior strategic research analyst from the Latvian Ministry of Defense. At the time, he was in his mid to late 50s, and he was extraordinarily knowledgeable about the former Soviet Union, the Baltic states, Eastern Europe, and Russia. Now, obviously, the reason is he told me he had been working in that space for like 3 decades. And if you put 2 and 2 together, that's during the end of the collapse of the Soviet Union and the immediate post-Soviet era. So he has a huge amount of knowledge. So I asked him once, I was like, what is Russia scared of? What is their defense leaders, what is their military scared of with regard to just global operations? And mind you, this was like, I don't know, 6 years ago. So it was not this is not Ukraine. This is post first invasion of Ukraine, obviously, but not current invasion. So this is post 2014. This was back in like 2017 is when I spoke to this gentleman. He said, first and foremost, it's not necessarily the U.S. That fight is already settled. And those are his words. He said it would be like the Los Angeles Lakers playing Valmiera, Valmiera is a Latvian pro team. Another side note, Latvians love the NBA. I've never seen in Europe more NBA jerseys and a love of basketball than in Latvia. I'm not entirely sure why that is, but it kind of was interesting seeing all of the different, and it was a mix. It was like Lakers and Knicks and different jerseys and things. So it was quite interesting. Anyways, I'm, again, getting off track. So he said it would be like the Lakers playing Valmiera. The Lakers would obviously destroy this team. So a Russian-U.S. fight wouldn't even be close. The U.S. would dominate them. Russia, he gave kind of an example, and this kind of made me chuckle because I don't operate in the Navy space. But he said that back when he was, as an early analyst back in the day in Latvia in the Soviet space, he said Russians would get unnerved when U.S. attack submarines would message the Russian submarines out of nowhere. The Russians often didn't even know U.S. attack subs were in the vicinity. And it was just a reminder that the U.S. was one step ahead of the Russians, and they did it to almost troll them. Now, the U.S. likely follows many of these Russian and Chinese and probably North Korean subs, and we do it in silence, but every once in a while, maybe to just create some sort of doubt in their own systems, they come out of the blue and communicate with them. So very interesting. But that didn't really answer my question. Like, if the U.S.-Russia situation, the NATO-Russia situation militarily is already settled, what exactly is Russia afraid of? And he said the biggest thing by far is losing control of their own people, meaning the growing divide of what the will of the people is and the aspirations of Putin and the Kremlin. That is the biggest fear the Russian Ministry of Defense, the Russian military, the Russian leadership have, is a potential civil war in Russia because the people's views and vision don't align with the Kremlin. And this is why we see such heavy-handed propaganda in this country. They have to justify why they're doing the things they're doing in Ukraine. So it makes sense. And he said that is the biggest reason. He said number 2 is losing global influence. And he said global influence to NATO, the collective West, the European Union. He said not just militarily, because that's, like he said, already settled, but economically. And what he sees is close partnerships that Russia used to have are chipping away. And you can kind of see this now. You see this in Armenia. You actually see this in places like Serbia, where some of the more rock solid foundations of support for Russia are going away. In fact, Ukraine is a representation of this. There used to have pro-Russian leadership in Ukraine, and they were removed from office, and the Ukrainians instilled a more pro-democracy regime, and not regime necessarily as Zelensky, but more pro-democracy government. And they did this through their own efforts, through their own votes. And it irritates me when people say the U.S. overthrew Ukraine. It discounts the nearly 50 million people's voices. They clearly wanted this. Countries that don't want to do things, the U.S. just doesn't have that level of influence. Afghanistan's a key example. We tried to remove the Taliban. We did remove the Taliban. We occupied that country, and the entire time we occupied that country, the Taliban was not in power. The minute we left, here's the Taliban again. I'm just saying that if those people that say that Ukraine didn't do this themselves give the Ukrainian people very little credit and give the U.S. way too much credit. I mean, we can't be both weak and pathetic and all powerful, as some of these people like to point us out to be. So that second thing is NATO's global influence, the European Union chipping away at the ability of Russia to use what used to be its soft power. Largely, most of Russia's soft power is completely gone because of what they've done in Ukraine. And the third thing, despite the fact that there's growing, what the media says is growing ties, Russia is always concerned about China. Russia knows that if it just leaves NATO alone, whether it's the U.S. or any of the Eastern European countries, the U.S. will not react. NATO won't react. NATO is a defensive treaty. NATO isn't going to just one day decide we're going to take Russia. That's never been the way NATO works. It's never happened in the history of ever. And the idea that Russia was attacking Ukraine because they were inevitably joining NATO makes no sense, because Finland is about to join NATO and went through the official process, and not a single attack took place on Finland. So this idea that Russia is scared of NATO is bullshit. But what they really are scared of militarily is China, because China is kind of a wild card on how they react to things. They have future ambitions, and they realize that they're facing a demographic decline. They're facing the ability to control things around them shrinking. And because of that, they need to bolster their capabilities and where they're weak, specifically in energy. Now, China doesn't need Russia. Russia needs China. China can still secure energy through global trade because, lo and behold, they aren't a terrible country invading another country like Ukraine. I just don't think that's going to happen with Taiwan. In fact, the CCP themselves have, as a baseline policy, say that they want a peaceful reunification. Everything else is just rhetoric. I mean, China's saying they're preparing for war by 2027, sure, but I just don't see it, because that gives Taiwan the ability to prepare and the U.S. the ability to prepare. So I just don't see it. But with regard to territory with Russia, China has had border conflicts with China. And since the 2000s, Russia can no longer control China enough to get adequate assurances. We just saw this recently when basically Xi Jinping demanded everything from Russia when it came to energy needs and trade, and Russia got nothing out of it. No weapons support, no aid support, nothing. So China has surpassed Russia in economic and military power several times over. And the Chinese are, on the global diplomatic stage, less reasonable than the European Union or NATO or the West. They tend to be more global empire minded than the U.S. The U.S. isn't looking or even speaking about taking territory from anyone. China's talking about taking territory from Taiwan, which they believe is their own. They have conducted some questionable things with regard to Hong Kong, and they have made no bones about the fact that they lost a good chunk of territory to Russia long ago, and they continue to talk about that. The U.S. is more stable with regard to a relationship potentially with Russia than China is, despite what we see in the media. And the problem for Russia is they share a border. So the reality is Russia currently is scared of three things: losing control of their own people, losing global influence, and potentially China turning on them for resources and other means.